Okay, everybody, welcome to the EOC review quiz video thingy for population dynamics. This is going to cover L.17.5, which is to analyze how population size is determined by births, deaths, immigration with an I, and immigration with an E. And yes, I do not hear a difference when you say those, so you need to be sure when somebody says immigration which one they're referring to. And limiting factors, biotic and abiotic, that determine carrying capacity. So we're going to be covering that. You can read the rest of this if you want to, just pause it. But I'm going to move on. Population dynamics is the first thing we're going to talk about. I want to talk about this graphic over here first because it shows you some levels of organization inside of the of any ecosystem, actually of the Earth. Because I want you to think, we're going to go from bottom to top and then go from top to bottom to understand these relationships. The first level here is the organism, the single organism, whatever this is, ring-tailed lemur, possum, thingamajigger, I don't know what it is. But this is the first level of any ecosystem. There's a bunch of these organisms, but we group them first into the organism level, okay? We talk about all of the bass, or all of the frogs, or all of the snakes, or all of the water lilies, or all of the, whatever lives there. We talk about that, right? Now, that's the organism level. I want you to tell the difference between the two because I'm going to kind of say the same thing for population level. But when you have a given area, such as Lake Okeechobee, and you talk about all of the bass, all of the smallmouth bass or largemouth bass in Lake Okeechobee, that's a population. Okay, an individual one is an organism, but we put those into groups called a population. That's not all of the smallmouth bass in the world. That's just all the ones in Lake Okeechobee. Okay, and even at that, we're still only talking about smallmouth bass. We're not talking about anything else, right? The next level is community. We're talking about the smallmouth bass and the snake and the deer and whatever else lives in that community of Lake Okeechobee. Now, so far we've talked about living things, right? The next thing I want to talk to you about, though, is the idea of the non-living parts as well. When you throw in the, up until this point, it's all been biotic. This is a biotic thing, this is a biotic thing, this is a biotic thing. But here we're going to add an abiotic thing, which includes the climate, natural disasters, the availability of of inorganic resources. I mean, it's all part of the ecosystem. That's everything, okay? That's everything in and around Lake Okeechobee. In fact, the Okeechobee's ecosystem is pretty large. It starts just south, well, it includes Disney World, believe it or not, and it comes all the way down through central Florida, right down the Kissimmee River Valley into Lake Okeechobee, and then it even goes south all the way over to Fort Myers and all the way over to just south of Boynton Beach, no, not Boynton Beach, Stewart, and all the way south into the Everglades. And this is called the KOE, or the Kissimmee Okeechobee Everglades ecosystem, and it's huge. And think about all the things that live in it, all the weather patterns, all the rainfall, every time something burns, every time something happens naturally. That's everything in the ecosystem, the biotic and the abiotic components, right? Now, when we think about this final level, the biosphere, we think about it as being a bunch of ecosystems working together, and they're terrestrial ecosystems and they're aquatic ecosystems, but they all interact with each other. For instance, just next to the Kissimmee Okeechobee Everglades ecosystem is the Peace River Valley ecosystem, and the two have an effect on each other. Things move back and forth between the two, and when it rains, sometimes the water goes in one and sometimes the water goes into the other. I saw a really cool picture on Facebook the other day that had a picture of a stream up in a mountain, and it showed the stream branching, one to the right, one to the left, and it said one of the water going to the left will end up in the Gulf of Mexico, the water going to the right will end up in the Pacific Ocean. And how crazy is that? Because that's the beginning of two separate ecosystems now, but they interact with each other at that point. And so ecosystems interact with each other to create the biosphere. Now let's do this in reverse. Here's the entire Earth. We can break it up into, in terms of biologically speaking, we can break it up into various ecosystems, and here are the ecosystems, okay? And let's just pick one ecosystem. This looks like a prairie, some type of a prairie habitat. In here we have all the parts of the ecosystem, but let's break it up, and let's just pay attention to the little, what are these, prairie dogs, I guess? This is all the prairie dogs and all of the butterflies and all of the owls. This is all the living components of the ecosystem. Is called the community. And we go break down that even further. We're just going to focus on one, the prairie dogs. These are all the prairie dogs in a community. We can go down even further to the prairie dog, just a prairie dog. That's the organism level. So biospheres are made of ecosystems, ecosystems made of communities, communities of populations, and populations are made out of organisms. And that's just kind of the way that they are structured and put together. Now, these everything interacts with each other. What is that thing called? What this prairie dog does, believe it or not, has an effect on a reindeer up in Africa, Alaska, or a Tamil deer down in South America. They have an effect on each other. It's not much, but it can have an effect because they do interact. We are all competing for all the water and all the resources here on this planet, and just because we regionally look at them in terms of ecosystems doesn't mean they don't connect. So the health of this ecosystem, whether it's the one I'm living in or the one 20,000 miles away, is important. Okay? So we talk about studying the populations of these things and how populations change, because the populations of each one of these is crucial to understand of every single organism. There's not an organism in here that isn't important. Now, can we live without some? Yes, but they all have an important role to play. So we need to study what happens to these populations. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this video, is studying populations, specifically biodiversity, and how we can conserve it. One of the things to talk about with populations are the limiting factors, which are pretty simple. I mean, what keeps these prairie dogs from just, they're crowded in? How come from the horizon to horizon we're just not just covered in prairie dogs? And the answer is there's something that limits that. And everything has a limiting factor. And so the limiting factors for the prairie dogs are going to be things like space and resources, and like food and water and mates and time, and there's just all kinds of things that affect how big the population gets. But it's important. And so some common limiting factors, by the way, these can be either biotic or abiotic, meaning that it's not necessarily just the abiotic. A lot of people think it's just abiotic because the list of things here, most of this is abiotic, right? But there are biotic things that limit population as well, such as predators, such as food and nutrients availability. All right, sunlight for plants. How much sunlight is there? In fact, you go to a very lush ecosystem like South America, and you're going to find that you have a huge competition for sunlight. The climate, is it too warm? Is it too cold? How come there aren't polar bears chasing me down outside my house when I go get into my Jeep? That's because it's too warm for them, right? Climate and temperature. So I guess climate also includes things like humidity and rainfall and things like that. So is it too dry? Is it too wet? There's all kinds of things that affect that. How much water is available? And believe it or not, most of the times people think, well, if there's not enough water, then nothing lives. But there are things that can't handle too much water. There are desert xeric type, that's XERIC, xeric type plants that can't handle a large amount of water. It'll kill them, right? How much nutrients or food is available? That's typically what's going on here, right? I mean, these guys reach a level in their population where they're eating. They all have something to eat, but if there was one more in there wouldn't be enough food to go around. So these guys are just barely not starving, and that's how most populations end up. Is they increase until they get to that point where something, usually food, keeps them from growing out of control. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. I think it's the next slide. Well, the slide after that. Well, maybe after that. All right. Anyway, soil chemistry, space being not outer space, but we're talking about space or room to get around, and other organisms such as predators or infectious diseases and things like that. So there's always a limiting factor to keep to a population growing out of control. Almost always. Sometimes we find a situation, it's very rare, but sometimes we find a situation where the population grows out of control. And that's usually when they're put into a place where there were these controls naturally, but we take them out of that and we put them into a new place where there aren't all these controls. The pythons down in the Everglades are, naturally in India, they have things that keep them under control. A mongoose, certain types of birds, things like that. You take them out of there and you put them into a very similar climate like the Everglades and let them go, and they thrive. They go like crazy, right? So when you take things out of natural places where their natural limiting factors keep them in control, they can grow out of control. They're called invasive exotic species. And exotic species are pretty bad. So yeah, that's a problem. I mean, you guys know the story of the pythons in in South Florida, right? There was a huge python breeding facility where they would breed them and sell them as pets down in Miami, and then along comes Hurricane Andrew and, tears the place up, and all those pythons ended up in the Everglades. But if those pythons were in, oh, I don't know, Virginia or something, they might have survived a winter or two, but after a while they would have froze to death. So a limiting factor there would have been temperature, but they don't have that limiting factor here in South Florida. It never gets so cold that they die, so as a result, they are thriving down in the Everglades. Okay, and in fact, that leads us to another thing that we want to talk about is what's called ranges of tolerance. For every limiting factor, there's a range of tolerance. Sometimes it's a very broad range, and sometimes it's a very narrow range. But this, for example, would be the temperature for steelhead trout in some type of a lake somewhere. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But the thing is that there is an optimal temperature. It looks like it's somewhere around 19, 18 degrees Celsius, which I don't know what that turns into for Fahrenheit, but it's fairly cool. 18 degrees Celsius is about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So they like it. If the water's that temperature, they like it. If it gets any warmer, they start to struggle. If it gets any warmer up to around 21 degrees Celsius, this is called a zone of physiological stress between 21 and 25, and they're stressed out. They're alive, but they're stressed out, and stressed out organisms don't reproduce, and so the populations drop. Now the population starts dropping when you get away from 50 degrees, because there's a little bit of stress here, and they're like, I'd like to have babies, but it's too hot, right? So, it gets to the point where now they're seriously, obviously, physiologically stressed, and they wouldn't reproduce even if they wanted to. And then it gets to the point where it's intolerant. They just can't take it. Anything above 25 degrees Celsius, and they won't grow. And that's, by the way, only about 80 degrees. If the water gets up to be about 80 degrees, they can't take it, right? Well, the same thing happens in reverse. It gets cooler. And after it gets too cold, they're down here, like, oh, it's too cold. We can't have babies. But here, they actually start getting stressed out down around 13 degrees Celsius, which I don't know what that is. Let's say 35, 40 degrees. Who knows? But then all the way down to 9 degrees, it's too cold and they can't survive anything below 9 degrees. So for every limiting factor, this limiting factor being temperature, there's a range of tolerance. There's an optimal range right here in the middle, and then in the left and the right, higher or lower. And you could do this with number of predators. You could do this with available nutrients. You could do this with available space. How much sunlight? Yes, there's too much sunlight possible for plants. They get to a point where they can't take it anymore. Too much light and it'll kill them. So, everything has a range of tolerance. So, something to think about, right? Now, something you would need to know about population dynamics. How do they change? What causes a change in the population of any given area? Remember, a population is the number of whatever these things are. They look starlings or something in any given area. Okay, so this isn't everything. This is just everything living in that area. How can the population go up or down? Well, there's 4 or 5 things. The first one is births. If you have successful births, then the number goes up. That makes sense, right? The opposite of that is deaths. If something eats the birds or the birds die for whatever reason, then the population goes down. So the number of births every year versus the number of deaths causes a change in ecosystem if they're not equal. If they're equal, then birth and deaths kept at the same. And that actually happens quite often, more than you think. The number that are born almost equal the number that die, right? Another one is called immigration. Now, immigration always happens both ways. Immigration with an I and immigration with an E. But whenever some birds are coming into a population, that's immigration with an I. Now remember, those birds had to leave a population somewhere else, so that was called immigration with an E. But immigration with an I is when these organisms move in. Immigration with an E is when they leave, and that happens all the time. So if you can calculate the number of birds coming in versus the number of birds leaving, and I'm just saying birds, but it could be anything, then you see that also has an effect on the population. So how many are born there or how many come there from another place, that increases. How many die there or how many leave to go somewhere else, that decreases. It's pretty easy, right? That's not all that complicated, but what causes these things is kind of interesting. Okay. Oh, look, same slide. I guess I already covered that. So, once again, just numbers of births versus numbers of deaths, and then immigration in and immigration out. Okay, now some limiting factors. There's 2 types of limiting factors. The first one is called density dependent. So this is dependent on how many organisms there are in the environment. The higher the number or the lower the number, then these factors kick in. Okay. Um, this could be things such as predation or herbivory, which is eating plants, parasites, disease. The higher the number in this case, the higher the number, the more likely that we're going to have something, some type of limiting factor that kicks in and says, okay, population is too high, somebody dies. So, if you get enough rabbits, something's going to come along and eat them, or they're going to get a parasite, or they're going to get a disease, or they're going to run out of food to eat, and it's going to lower the population again. Now, it's usually pretty tragic, and I'll show you in a graph here in a minute. It's never just a nice smooth curve like, oh, you got one too many, let's just kill that one. Normally, if you get close to the top of the curve of the population because you've hit that limiting factor, normally a lot of them die off and it goes way back down below the limiting factor. You'll see that in a graph in just a minute. These become limiting factors only when the population reaches a certain level. So they are dependent on the population, the density, how much population is there in any given area. Okay, like we said, diseases, competition, predation, too much waste. There's all kinds of things that can cause it, but these depend on whether or not the population is too high or not. And I guess technically too low, but most often is the population too high, and if so, these factors kick in. Now there's another type of factor called density independent factors, which literally has nothing to do with the population. It's going to happen whether the population is high or low. Okay, these are things like seasonal cycles, unusual weather, temperature, precipitation, natural disturbances, even human activities such as damming rivers and clear cutting forests had nothing to do with the population being high or low. It just happened. So these have an effect on the population as well, and it really doesn't matter what their density is, whether it's high or low. So that's another example. All right, so there's two types of growth curves that happen when populations go up, and populations tend to go up when something changes in the environment, and that could be anything like a little bit more rain. The predators get some kind of a disease causing their numbers to go down. If the predator population goes down, what happens to the prey population? It goes up, right? But there's two types of curves. The first one is called a J curve, and it's called an exponential growth phase. And it happens for lots of things, usually insects and small animals, and it can also happen for plants and fungus. But there's a dormant time. A dormant time is called the lag phase, and all of a sudden something changes in the environment, and bang, they grow like crazy. And I'm talking about we're talking about a population boom. The growth goes through the charts. Now the problem with this is what? These things grow. They usually try to reproduce real fast, and then what do? The rest of this is that they die off and they go back into the lag phase. That's how a J curve usually works. We see this happening with populations that struggle. They're struggling a lot, like rodents. This rodent population is struggling, and all of a sudden something changes in the environment to temporarily take out the limiting factors that's causing them to struggle, and boy, their population explodes. Okay, and then for whatever reason, either another limiting factor or something, the original limiting factor comes back, but for some reason they hit a peak and then they come right back down. Right? That's how a J curve works. The other type of curve is a little more common. It's called the logistical growth curve, the S curve, and it's a little bit different. It starts out with a lag phase, and then over time it increases because something changes. The carrying capacity, there's a new term for us. The carrying capacity was down here. This red line, the carrying capacity, how many organisms an individual geographical area can maintain, or how big the population can be in that area. That line was down here, but then all of a sudden something changed. Okay, and boom, the carrying capacity goes up, and so now pardon me, now we can have more, and slowly that number will increase until it approaches the carrying capacity, and then it levels off again. This is common in I don't know, things like predators or fish or something like that, where there's a change in the environment, where there's all of a sudden more food or more space, or some type of more resources, more light maybe for trees, more mates, maybe some mates moved in from another species and now the carrying capacity could go up. There's lots of reasons that carrying capacity can go up. Now I'd like to take a second and tell you about humans, because this is a really interesting story to me. This is a great example of what's happening to humans, although we don't know if we're on the logistical curve or the S curve, right? I'm sorry, the exponential curve, the J curve, or the logistic curve, the S curve. This is what's happening to humans right now. Up until about 1850, the population of the Earth hovered at below a billion people. Never had gone higher than that. Okay, and then somewhere around 1850, the number started to go up, and now here we are. We're somewhere over here. We don't know where this is because we don't know what the carrying capacity is for the Earth right now, and we don't know how fast we're approaching it. We could be on an exponential curve or a logistical curve, and we don't know which is which because we don't know where that carrying capacity is. And what happened here, the carrying capacity used to be way down here. Diseases and lack of resources, lack of energy, lack of nutrients kept the human population at around 1 billion people. Then all of a sudden, two things happened. It was really one thing, but it's kind of two things. It's called the Industrial Revolution, and because of the Industrial Revolution, we started using petroleum. And now all of a sudden, it's gone up here. This carrying capacity jumped way up, and we don't know where it is. Okay? Now, the thing is we could be here on this curve approaching the carrying capacity slowly, and we'll do that. We'll level off. We may go a little bit over it, and then we'll have to come back down. And you know what it means? Whenever this comes down, a lot more people die than are born, right? But it'll be smooth. It'll be kind of down and down, up until we level off around it. Okay, but we could also be on this curve, which means that we've already temporarily overshot it. We could be here, okay, on this this exponential growth, and we're growing like crazy, and we've already gone way past the carrying capacity. We don't know it. And what did I say always happens? It gets up here, and trust me, you don't want to be here when this curve comes back down. Okay. The truth is both of these I find frightening because the carrying capacity right now is high because of one thing, and that's technology and petroleum, right? If something happens to either one of those, what happens to the carrying capacity? It goes back here. And no matter which curve we're on, what has to happen to the population has to go back down here. And anytime this goes down, it's gruesome and ugly. And so I get kind of concerned about the population of the Earth. There's too many people, and it's getting scary. But that's another discussion, all right? Predation and herbivory affect the size of a population. This is called the predator-prey relationship. When predators have plenty to eat, their population grows. As the predator population grows, they begin to kill more prey than are born, and this causes the prey population to drop. So now, with the prey population falling, they don't have as much to eat, so what happens to the predator population? It's got to fall. And as the predator population falls, guess what happens to the prey population? Well, there aren't so many predators, now they can do better. The prey population goes back up, then the predators follow, blah, blah. It's crazy. Here is a graph of an island called Isla Royale, which is, I think, somewhere in one of the Great Lakes. And on these islands, or on this particular island, there is a population of moose and a population of wolves. And there's a really great place to study this kind of stuff because new wolves don't get there and new moose don't get there easily. So you can just do an annual count of both and realize that this isn't due to any immigration in or out. This is simply births and deaths, right? And so notice the moose population, which is the red line, and the wolf population. When the wolf population was high, the moose population was low. Okay, if the wolf population dropped, notice it was because the moose population dropped. Something caused the moose population to go down, probably too daggone many wolves caused the moose population to go down. What happens to the wolf population? But then the moose population starts to go up. What happens to the wolf population? Okay, and sometimes it goes back and forth. Sometimes it's like, hey, look at all the wolves, right? But at this point right here, the wolves, there were so many wolves, the moose population was struggling. And then there was a virus called CPV. All of a sudden killed off truckloads of wolves. I mean, we're talking about, we went down from 50 to 10, although that's probably in hundreds, probably 500 to 100, I really don't know. Now we're down to this many wolves. Well, notice what happens right after that to the moose population. It spikes. This is not good. Of course, this isn't good either, and that's typically what happens. The wolf population got too large, and something, in this case a virus, said, oh, too high, knock you back down here. Well, now the moose population spikes. This is too high. It's going close to or past the carrying capacity for moose, and so what happens? The wolves are like, hey, we can take care of that, and they start killing off the moose. And notice, it's like a dance. It goes back and forth. This will happen in the future as long as there are mooses and wolves on this island. This will keep happening, this back and forth. Who knows what it's like? We started measuring in 1955, but who knows what happened in the 1930s or the 20s or the 1800s? We don't know. But this is the kind of thing that constantly happens. And so this is a natural cycle, and as long as humans don't get involved, this should continue for a long time, naturally. Okay. All right. Biodiversity refers to the variety and species of diversity of life on Earth. A healthy ecosystem with plenty of biodiversity can influence our lives in many different ways. We love biodiversity. Biodiversity is good, but we need to learn how to preserve biodiversity. Biodiversity is how many different kinds of living things there are on the earth, and in order to protect that, we have to make sure that they have all the resources that they need. So we have to start protecting our water resources, because we do that in lots of ways: by plants holding onto roots and stabilizing the soil, preventing soil erosion, and in particular, preventing the runoff of the nutrients that have been there for forever. But when they erode and want to run away, they're gone now, and so that ecosystem has lost all those nutrients and they won't ever come back. And so we have to protect our water resources, and one of the best ways to do that is protecting the ecosystem as it naturally was, because it took care of itself for a long time by leaving the plants and the trees that are there, right? Plus, the plants and the trees that are there provide for the other parts of the ecosystem, and so this is the first step, is making sure that there's no damage to the water flow in the ecosystem, and it helps to keep it from losing all of its nutrients. Okay, and plus that runoff then goes into other bodies of water. Now they've got too much nutrients, so it causes problems there too. So letting it flow naturally is what's important. Soil's formation and protection is another one. As organisms decay and die, they create soil. So soil is important. Now we're talking about land-based ecosystems, but the same stuff kind of applies to water-based. But as land-based ecosystems, things in them die, they start creating soil. Soil is crucial for every land-based ecosystem. The thing is that with things like water erosion or wind erosion, all those nutrients and all that soil can be blown somewhere else, and so you can lose a huge amount of the nutrients naturally found in your ecosystem just by this erosion. And that's why in the United States and in other parts of the world, they have actually an entire service called the Soil Conservation Service, whose sole job is to make sure that we're not losing this stuff to erosion. So they come along and they say, I know you want to build this here, but you can't do it because it's going to increase the amount of erosion. The nutrient storage and cycling and recycling is crucial. So we have to make sure we studied these cycles: the carbon cycle, water cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle. The more plant diversity, the more nutrient available there is in the food chain, and so we want to make sure that we have a high diversity to keep these nutrient cycles going. And finally, pollutants created by humans. Sometimes there's pollutants that come naturally, but most of the time pollutants created by humans. Trust me, biodiversity helps us deal with pollution. Things like bacteria and fungus can help break down these things. There's bacteria and fungus that can break down oil spills, which is crazy. They eat it like candy. So the thing is biodiversity is crucial for all life on Earth. They contribute to climate stability, vegetation, plenty of different kinds of vegetation, helps to pull the carbon out of the air and keep the planet cooler. So the more plants we have, the better, especially trees. They maintain ecosystems because all organisms need each other for survival. So, there's shelter. Things live in trees, things live under trees, things live in forests, things live in the ground, and they have to be protected. So a diversity of species creates a diversity of species. The more biodiversity you have, typically the more biodiversity you get. And so by preserving biodiversity, we're actually helping to preserve biodiversity. I know that's kind of stupid sounding. And then recovery from unpredictable events. And to me, this is what I always thought was the most important value of biodiversity. A very biodiverse ecosystem can handle a catastrophic event such as a fire or a flood, or human-caused, tragedies such as oil spills. And when you have a biodiverse ecosystem, it can recover from these things much faster because of the fact that there's a lot of possible different ways in which it can handle this catastrophe. If the trees burn down, it's okay. We've got brushes, we've got plants, grasses. If the tall trees burn down, we saw the short trees, and that's because of biodiversity. So, and then those trees will come back very rapidly because there's plenty of nutrients in the soil. There's plenty of soil there because of the biodiversity that's producing the soil. So the recovery can be much faster. Low biodiversity is all over the planet. There's a lot of low biodiverse ecosystems that are naturally low in biodiversity because of a limiting factor like temperature and whatnot. Deserts, there's a limiting factor there of rainfall. There's a limiting factor there of nutrients. There's a limiting factor there of water or of temperature. And so those have a low biodiversity, and we have to be very careful because they can't recover from catastrophic events in human caused events. So have to be very careful of that. And that's it. That's the end of the thing. Just a quick review of the importance of population and the importance of biodiversity. And I'm going to stop there and have you guys go take the Start Here or the Check Yourself quiz and see how you do. All right. Thank you.